why, if defense acquisition is in such a point of crisis, and we know that the contracting workforce has been kind of gutted of talent, why don't we use those same mechanisms to build up our acquisition team, our contracting teams? Why aren't we bringing in people who are going to take a year off of their finance job to teach them how to put in place a multi-billion-dollar contract for the next major capability that drives United States national interests? I mean, that's a pretty compelling offer, especially if you only have to do it for 2 years.
When you look at the intersection of policy and technology, and you then apply that into acquisition, right? I think you can't throw a stone in defense or defense tech without folks talking about, the valley of death and sort of how challenging it is to understand and navigate sort of the morass that is defense acquisition. I guess the first question is, as you look out at it, what do you think the problem is? And then what are ways folks should be thinking about approaching that? And I guess the overall one is, do you think we're looking at it the right way or the wrong way right now?
Yeah, well, super thoughtful question with so much wrapped into it. So maybe I'll just start at the very end, which is, I think people are missing half the picture, at least half the picture. So the vast majority of the debate, as you mentioned, around defense acquisition and all of the challenges that are associated with it, of which there are many, are really policy debates. They're about whether the department has the right authorities from Congress. They're about whether the PPBE process is operating properly, which is really a policy-driven process and standards. And it's about, whether the department is thinking about these things from the right perspective and has the right culture in the institutions, et cetera, et cetera. None of which is wrong. And certainly we need a lot of things to change in all of those regards. Well, I take that back. I actually think DoD has all the authorities it needs. I often say that the FAR is, people talk about, we need acquisition reform, or we don't need acquisition reform, but we need more change. And say things like, I want to burn the FAR to the ground, or we've got to start over. I love the FAR. It's like a choose your own adventure. You remember those books?
Oh, yeah.
People need to treat it that way instead of treating it like it's the Baltimore Catechism. And then you can get everything done that you need to get done. So that's the piece that people are talking about and I think are focused on correctly. The piece that they're incredibly missing is there's a really mundane, unglamorous, but wildly important aspect to making acquisition work better for the warfighter, which is just the day-to-day workflows that people in the acquisition workforce execute and the capabilities they have been given or not been given to execute those day-to-day workflows. That's the process improvement piece that the private sector has revolutionized over the past 20 years, while DoD still runs on email, data calls, and spreadsheets.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about sort of the how instead of, the what or the who, because I think you're right. I think the policies and the authorities sort of all exist. But, we often, and I think the acquisition sort of procurement communities always are the ones getting spears thrown at them for how they issue an RFP or how they're assessing or how they're engaging with. To your point, I think sometimes they're given a raven, like the bird, to send messages to each other, not even the crappy drone. And we're under-resourcing them in a lot of ways and asking them to scale their impact and increase sort of the volume and velocity with which they can prosecute their mission without thinking about what are the, whether it's the technical tooling, the process, or just the governance layer from like a data and observability, and how to make that sort of a more modular or modernized sort of capability. As you look at that, sort of where do you start? Because just even explaining it that way it becomes sort of like a 500-pound gorilla, right? It's a huge problem.
It's a huge problem. And I think that's so important because it's part of the reason that even though DoD isn't taking the initiative to bring in modern workflow software for this community, the commercial sector hasn't pushed it either, which is really interesting. The reason that we've got these really exciting new defense tech companies competing for the next big unmanned X is because the commercial sector is pushing their way in. But we haven't seen that happen with this very, like I said, sort of mundane and more importantly, really esoteric and hard to get to and understand space and community. And I think that's the key because DoD keeps adding more people into the program office staffs. Basically, that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the program executive offices, the program offices, the sustainment centers, the materiel commands, the lifecycle management centers, all of these communities that are responsible for conceiving of, I would include the labs and some of the requirements community there, actually fielding and producing the capabilities. And then really importantly, because it's 70% of the weapon system's lifetime costs, sustaining them. So out of all of those people, where are the modern, defense tech software companies coming in and saying, we know what you're trying to achieve and we have cutting edge, best in class software to help you do it? Until Govini, nobody was doing that. And part of the reason is because these users are hard to get to. DoD isn't asking for the help in this area, to your point. And they do work that's really complex and hard to understand unless you kind of know the defense space already.
So flipping that around, I think anyone who's talked to a contracting officer, I think recognizes that there's usually a couple different forces at play, right? To your earlier point about sort of the FAR, I think there has been sort of generations of, what I used to call in the military a barracks lawyer, where someone had said, no, you're not allowed to do this. And then that got passed on in this like game of generational telephone. So their perception of what they're actually allowed to do gets infinitely smaller. And then on the other side, there's this like big, I'm going to go to jail for this. I'm going to go to jail for this. So there's this also kind of like institutional fear, I think, of pushing or a perception of institutional fear. And then you've got sort of some like mavericks floating around to your point are like, hey, yeah, like FAR lets me do all of this stuff. It's freaking great. How do you think about the sort of behavioral change or the cultural change at that user level as you're going in? Because that to me is like the generational, that's the lift you get where like you just advance national security 10x.
Absolutely. And the people who are willing to be creative are truly mavericks. So I think the key to getting mass adoption or turning them all into people who love to use all the full authorities and options the FAR provides is about better sharing information. A lot of times I think the mission owners in the department forget that their contracting officer is meant to be a business advisor to them. Tara, the mission owner, is supposed to go to Tyler, the contracting officer, and say, here's what I'm trying to achieve. What's the right strategy from an acquisition perspective for me to get there? And then you to be empowered to actually give me meaningful advice and options.
That's a good point.
And that's not really how it happens today.
No, not
usually.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's Tara, the mission owner, shoves this down the contracting officer's throat and says it's the fastest way to get it done, or I have to go use this company, figure out how, and they turn into box checkers. Well, when you turn them into box checkers, you kind of demotivate them and you don't incentivize them to get creative and take a little risk and focus on, we got to make the mission happen, and so let's, like I said, get creative. So I think we need to really, really make better information available across that workforce and train them up to be business advisors.
Yeah. So that's one. I mean, I agree that that's not happening. There are pockets, and it's the pockets you'd think, right? Yeah. It's those type of cultures. So I'll flip that question back around then and say, okay, if we're looking to make sort of that contracting officer, that procurement shop, that sort of business advisor, what's your message then to the mission owner who, for the last decade has been like, whatever, contract nerd, go get me my widget, figure it out. And they're just like shrieking at the wind. What is that sort of engagement? Because I would imagine, right, in order for an organization to be able to drive sort of that technology change and change the way end users are engaging and sharing information, there's the relationship between the mission user and the contracting officer. And then there's also like a philosophical transformation from like a sort of industrial age down and in, I control all data, thus I have power, into a knowledge age, I share and disseminate information, and the power is actually the collective. That, historically, the government's not been super great at sharing information, dare I say. So,
To put it
what does that look
mildly.
like? Yeah, you guys end up in like a really unique spot at an intersection of a lot of these sort of, generational change forces and technical challenges inside a pretty critical
Absolutely.
mission.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, the best way to get those mission owners to, I think, maybe come at it from a different perspective would be to walk a mile in the shoes of the people who are performing the acquisition tasks. And that's easier said than done. But to be honest, if you look at another area of the intersection of defense and tech where the department's gotten really creative on job training and job opportunities. Remember way back when Defense Digital Service was running around the Pentagon in their hoodies for the first time, saying like, "Please, you have to bring engineers into this organization." Well, over the subsequent years, DoD got really good at using all sorts of creative hiring mechanisms and making different kinds of exceptions to be able to hire at higher salaries than the traditional GS scale, to create rotations in and out of, public sector and private sector, all sorts of creative things.
Yeah.
Why, if defense acquisition is in such a point of crisis, and we know that the acquisition workforce, I should say the contracting workforce, has been kind of gutted of talent, why don't we use those same mechanisms to build up our acquisition team, our contracting teams? Why aren't we bringing in people who are going to take a year off of their finance job to teach them how to put in place a multi-billion-dollar contract for the next major capability that drives United States national interests? I mean, that's a pretty compelling offer, especially if you only have to do it for 2 years.